The question I want to ask you is, what does the pandemic teach? What are the things that are revealed about capitalism that are very easy to see now that maybe they were more difficult to see 2 months ago?
It's something I've thought a lot about, and the students have as well. The one that keeps coming up for me and the students is how artificial in the moment of crisis this thing called the economy actually appears to be. I mean, so for weeks we've been reading in the course before there was this pandemic. We've been reading about the ways in which one might want to be skeptical of a notion of the economy in big capital letters or quotation marks or whatever marks it off as a thing that's out there and it is identifiable, and that economists and politicians would tell you was sort of the sum of monetary exchanges within particular borders or within the world, right? So there's the Connecticut economy and the national economy and the global economy, right? You can just count this up.
Which is like a really modern idea.
It's a very modern idea. I mean, there's various sort of genealogies of how this came to be, but clearly it wasn't with us in this form before the middle of the 20th century. And even then it was a fairly minority view. It's sort of taken over everybody's imagination in recent times. But
is that a function of data collection? Is it the scope of our understanding, like GDP?
I would guess that broader historical things afoot that sort of launched this concept, but it was totally grown up with this idea of big data, that you could measure it, that the economy was a thing that could be counted and measured because it's basically tracking monetary exchanges. And if you look hard enough, and if you come up with the right data tools for both collection and analysis, you can slice it and dice it in 1,000 different ways and say something about it. But the massive disruptions of the crisis and the pandemic have made so clear how that's not really an adequate way of talking about what goes on that is economic activity. And you see this in domain after domain. I mean, one of them is this discourse between we have to save the economy or we have to take care of people's health. And that is openly being contested. So, like, the fact that the economy, like, you typically find in American discourse that kind of challenge to the notion of the economy. Everybody thinks it's somehow sacred. But very quickly, people came to challenge the sacredness of the economy as a particular kind of all-encompassing and all-governing concept. You see it in, everybody now working from home and juggling childcare and more traditional labor employment. Childcare is typically, it doesn't, work that parents do on reproductive labor, highly gendered category, it doesn't fall into typical notions of the economy. You don't count the work that you do educating your children as part of the economy, but everyone's finding out that that's a hell of a lot of work, and it's it's really important, but that doesn't count in the economy. People are suddenly finding the ways in which all these things we take for granted about the economy, like the availability of toilet paper, are things that are very much in question in their own lives. And they're reading about, thinking about, talking about very sort of complex supply chain. Where does something come from? And where do I get it? And what are the relations behind that? In ways that are much more like, in other times I have to teach students to do, or what anthropologists do is think, how is that organized?
Right.
What is actually at the center of this thing called the economy? Yeah. We don't think about much of the time, but all of a sudden it turns out to be immigrants in meatpacking plants or
hospitals,
right? Or at hospitals who are, or in grocery stores or things like this. All of these things sort of expose the way in which our conventional understandings of the economy are actually put together. They're made up. They're not made up in the sense that they're fictional. They're very real, but they are made by humans and made consistently.
Yes. I mean, one of the things that's been really striking to me, and this is a lesson that one would have thought we had learned in 1929, but obviously we didn't, is that the aggregate data actually conceal at least as much as they reveal. And so as the economy seems to be humming along 6 months ago, what is concealed is that roughly half of the population or more is living from paycheck to paycheck and is just like 1 week away from total household disaster and crisis. Same thing in 1929. The aggregate data for the 1920s looked pretty great. Suddenly, the mask was ripped off and the entire country was in crisis. And it feels like we're actually going through that exact scenario again, having learned nothing.
In so-called ordinary times, which let's just say 6 months ago, you had to look really hard to find people who were talking about the paycheck to paycheck nature of most people's work, or the lack of savings, or the ways in which all these other things fall outside of the economy, and including such basic things that are not all common, such as reproductive labor or gender division of labor, household labor. Like all these, those were places you had to look hard to find people studying them, and you never found them on TV or influencing the political process, or very rarely. But all of a sudden, yes, all those things suddenly reveal a massively different thing that everybody's struggling to figure out.